Hello, welcome to my little commentary on comic opera in the 18th century. So ever since Metastasio had reformed opera seria around the early 18th century, comic elements had been banished really from the stage. So you can imagine that audiences were still eager to see something comic, and they of course were also, especially middle class audiences, were also interested in seeing something in their own language that they understood because they did not necessarily speak Italian. So we've already seen how in London Handel's plans to develop a thriving opera seria tradition were thwarted by the incredible popularity of the ballad opera, The Beggar's Opera by John Gay. So I introduced that to you briefly, just to recapitulate. This opera was tailor-made for a kind of middle-class audience. You can imagine how refreshing they found plays that had characters that they recognized from contemporary life, speaking and singing in a language that they spoke and understood, English, singing tunes that they already recognized, because John Gay did not write any music. He just took existing popular melodies and wrote words to fit them, and then strung together a story. So that's essentially ballad opera. Here's a little, again, recapitulating description of The Beggar's Opera. This is a little clip from a trio called Would I Might Be Hanged. There's a nice description of it in your book. You're not going to hear very good singing here, but that's not the point. The audiences are not there to hear great singing. They want to hear stories, characters, and a language that they understand, that they feel like they can relate to. Now, let's move across Europe to Italy, where just a few years later develops the most important comic opera tradition, opera buffa. Now, its origins are fairly humble. Italian comic opera, opera buffa, begins very much like opera itself had begun in the 16th century, as intermedi, that is, as light entertainment at the intermission of a much longer, more serious drama. In this case, the composer Pergolesi created a comic opera to go at the intermissions of his much longer opera seria. But let's back up a little bit and look at some of the tradition of Italian comic entertainment that was so important in conditioning opera buffa. The Italian comic informal theater is known as the Commedia dell'arte, and it's incredibly important for the development of opera buffa, and in fact it informs comic traditions well into our century. You recognize these stock figures, particularly the Harlequin, Pierrot, Colombine, Pantalone. In fact, throughout Europe there were informal comic traditions, that is, improvised theater, not written down. Troupes of actors would go from one town to the next, taking all of their simple props that they needed, setting up the stage on whatever was available. They had stock stories. The Don Giovanni story is such a stock story that they would stage. Their characters were stock. They would adapt their stories to whatever, to the town, to what was going on in the town, the major figures in the town. And then they would improvise in entertainment. So we'll come back to this. The characters that you are very familiar with, especially from Don Giovanni and The Barber of Seville, The Marriage of Figaro, all have their roots in the Commedia dell'arte tradition. Now let me pick up my discussion of Pergolesi. So as I said, he was a successful composer, was writing opera seria, but he had the idea of creating a comic opera that would fit into a short comic opera that would fit into the intermissions of his much longer opera seria. Well, that opera seria has been long forgotten. His audience responded much more to the comic opera. There's a nice discussion of that opera called La Serva Padrona in your text. Here is a very fine performance of the aria, which is described and translated on 224. I give a pretty lengthy commentary or analysis of the music of the final duet. Here, I put a YouTube clip of it, mostly so you can see these actors, who are not even singing actors, do their little comic shtick. That is derived directly from the Commedia dell'arte tradition. And in fact, all physical comedy up to this day, or in some way or the other, have their roots in that Commedia dell'arte tradition. So enjoy that. So, La Serva Padrona was so popular that they took it on the road, and they took it to Paris. Now, you can well imagine, as you know, there was a great tradition of serious opera going back to Lully in Paris, and the Parisians, just like they are today, are rather guarded about their culture. So, the success of La Serva Padrona in Paris in 1752 caused quite a stir in the newspapers. The philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who himself had written an opera, not a very good one, by the way, but very well known, got involved. He was a big champion of the Italian comic tradition because he liked its qualities of kind of artless characters, more natural, not so cultured, characters that an average person could relate to. These are qualities that he thought the French culture desperately needed. So read up on that. One thing that controversy accelerated was the development of a French vernacular tradition of non-serious opera. Now, I use the term non-serious because it's not the case that all of these operas were funny. Opera comique, we think, translates to comic opera, but it's not comic in our contemporary sense of the term. It just simply means that they're not tragic. That means they have a happy ending. And the characters are drawn from contemporary life, and that the stories are light. They're not weighted with these kind of archetypal figures that we're used to from opera seria. So opera comique develops, there's actually several comic traditions that develop in France. One, the vaudevilles, which is similar to the ballad operas in that they're using existing tunes. But a true tradition of music develops in opera comique because composers are writing all the music tailor-made for a specific text. Opera comique becomes really quite influential, even, believe it or not, to serious opera as the century progresses. And we'll see this as we move on and study Gluck in the next part of the unit. Opera comique continues on to the 19th century. Bizet's Carmen is actually officially an opera comique. It was premiered at the theater called the Opera Comique, and it had spoken dialogue. That's why it's officially an opera comique. And of course, the characters, as you might know, is drawn from everyday life. The last 18th century comic tradition to develop was the German Singspiel. It's kind of ironic that the Singspiel was a late bloomer because German opera, as we'll study later on, comes to dominate the development of opera, not just comic opera, but serious opera in the 19th century. But in the 18th century, it was really a backwater. The opera that was performed throughout the 18th century in German-speaking cities was overwhelmingly Italian opera seria. One of the first important Singspiels was written by Mozart. It's like 1781. But even that wasn't that big of a success, and as you'll later study, and you may already know, he's far more famous for his opera buffa, which he wrote after the Singspiel. Even in the German-speaking Vienna, the audience preferred opera buffa to Singspiel in their native German. It was only his last opera, Magic Flute, where he created something that was going to be, have kind of lasting popularity. But that's another story for a later chapter.